entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
Yep, still better than the anime series. Oh boy, I know I'm gonna get a lot of flack for this video. In my first live stream back after my 2-year hiatus, I revealed to my audience that not only did I no longer consider Dragon Ball Z my favorite anime series, but by 2019 standards, I didn't think the series really held up that well. And as you can imagine, the comment section exploded with debate. So, why would I go ahead and make such a claim? Well, let's talk about it. Now, for the sake of this video, I will be speaking primarily about the original Dragon Ball Z anime series. This is the series that comprises mostly of 276 episodes. This is the series that ran on Cartoon Network, courtesy of Toonami, from the late 90s to the early 2000s, and this is the series that most fans are familiar with. I won't be talking about Dragon Ball GT very much, and if I do mention Super, it will probably be as a supplemental piece, but my main focus is going to be that original DBZ series. I may also speak about Dragon Ball Kai, but that's going to be for more of a comparison. First things first, let's talk about the objective of why DBZ doesn't really hold up very well. And when I mean objective, I mean these are things that can be measured. These are things that we can look at, that we can go to, and that we can make an accurate assessment as to whether or not we think it holds up very well. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, which is the biggest complaint about this series, and it's the one that most people will agree about, the fillers. Now, we know that filler has always been a major problem within the anime medium. There are so many series that implement it. There are several reasons as to why, but by and large, we can mostly agree fillers don't really do the anime much favors. Now, of course, yes, Dragon Ball Z is not the most egregious when it comes to fillers. I mean, for an example, Naruto and Bleach will create entire story arcs all filler. But the thing about DBZ's fillers that I don't think really hold up very well, and I think they really are a hindrance to the series overall, is because the way in which they're implemented. Now, DBZ was one of the first, and especially one of the most popular anime series to take their filler and to use it to stretch out the canon material. This is the same technique that you'll see implemented in the One Piece anime series. And there are some pros and cons to doing that. Of course, we know that the main reason why this was because most of these popular anime series, they're adapting popular manga series. And the one thing that the anime studios want to prevent at any and all possible is to catch up to the source material being circulated at the same time. So they create filler so that they don't have to take time off the air, they can still produce episodes every week, and they don't catch up to the source material. It makes sense. Also, in DBZ's case, we already know that that production was utilizing 3 different animation studios. So you had 3 different studios that were all working on episodes at the same time. So the way in which DBZ created their filler and the way in which they implemented it within the main series, within the main timeline, and within the main narrative, we understand why it happened. But the point is that it still happened. And when you go back and rewatch the series with a critical eye, yeah, it is a hindrance. This is why we get the several episodes where characters are basically spending 20 to 24 minutes just powering up. And you have secondary characters that are pretty much narrating what it is we're seeing on screen, but it all amounts to them just powering up. I mean, say what you will about some of the newer series. Yes, we already know Naruto, yeah, 80 plus episodes of filler in between part 1 and Shippuden. Yes, that is somewhat annoying. But at least those were complete narratives, and at least those fillers stood alone as sort of their own production. Same thing with the Bleach filler. Bleach is notorious for having multiple story arcs that are comprised of filler, but as I just said, those are separate storylines, they're set apart from the main storyline, and they are their own little miniature production. The one thing that those fillers do to their respective series that creates the hindrance is that they break up the flow of the main narrative, which, let's be honest, if you're following this on a week-by-week basis, as many of us were back then, yeah, then you're just going to create some problems. DBZ, on the other hand, utilizing their filler when you're stretching out source material, which is very thin to begin with, and then you're stretching this thing out for another 5 to 6 episodes. Even back then, in the 90s and in the 2000s, when we got 5 episodes a week, even then, having to wait from day to day, episode to episode with no real plot progression, yeah, does not serve the series very well. So the reason why I said that by 2019 standards, this is one of the things that DBZ doesn't really hold well in respect of, is because keep in mind, how do we consume media by 2019? We do a lot of binging, we do a lot of streaming. The entirety of this series has been collected on multiple DVD box sets and on Blu-ray. So when you're marathoning episodes and you have to deal with these fillers stretching out the canon material, yeah, it gets a little tedious after a while. The second thing I'll go ahead and mention is the music, the scores. I have always applauded Bruce Faulconer and his sort of alternative rock scores added to this series. When you look at this thing sort of in a time capsule, when you look at it as its own isolated production, you know what? It really is a product of its time. That music was on the rise in the late 90s and early 2000s, especially even if you look at the DBZ movies, a lot of them did incorporate popular rock music at the time. Things from like Disturbed, Breaking Benjamin, Drowning Pool, Papa Roach, all those type of things you will see in those films. So when Bruce Faulconer came along and he did his score, yeah, he was kind of piggybacking off of that same vibe. And I would say that in many respects, it does heighten the experience. But this is when it becomes a hindrance. Once again, going back to the filler material, when you have this filler material and it's stretching out your canon material and you're stretching out the series by multiple episodes where nothing is really happening to progress that narrative, that music being added to it, after a while starts to lose its effect. Why? Because it's being implemented over scenes that have little to no significance. Here's the other thing too. Bruce Faulconer, pretty good composer. And like I said, that score, man, when you add that score to some of the fight scenes, man, some of the best stuff you've ever seen. But when you add it as background music, it totally dampens the effect. We're hearing it too much, we're hearing it too often, and not with enough gusto. That's another thing that I don't really think adds well to the series overall. Another thing I'll mention, let's talk about dialogue. Now, the dialogue, by and large, especially when you're dealing with an anime series, there's a couple of things you have to take in consideration. Number one, you have to take in consideration the script. Number two, you have to take in consideration the translation. And then number three, you have to take in consideration the voice actors. That being said, many talented voice actors can bring in great performances with mediocre scripts. That I do concede. But here's the thing with that. At the start of this video, I was holding up what is a Japanese Dragon Ball Z animanga. For those of you all unfamiliar with animanga, an animanga simply takes screenshots from the actual anime production and it places it within the manga format, just like if you were reading the original manga. Now, the funny thing about animanga though, much of the dialogue in an animanga will favor more of the original source material, not the translation. So when you start to look at that material in this light, particularly when you have the canon manga material, then you have the adapted anime material, and then you could see what both of those things could turn into when you don't have filler, when the pacing is the way it was originally intended, and when you have to relay the same amount of written content to the reader as you would of readers of the original manga as well as viewers of that anime series, you get a much different product. The original Dragon Ball Z anime series, when you look at it in that fashion, does not hold up well to translation. This is where Dragon Ball Kai comes into play. Dragon Ball Kai, I think, does a much better job in translating the original source material to the anime format. So with that being said, if you go back to the original Dragon Ball Z series, once again, bringing up the whole filler bit, bringing up the way in which they're stretching the content, you will find that there is a lot of dialogue that's just added in lip service. As I mentioned before, we have countless episodes where characters are just repeating to us what we're already seeing on screen. Or we'll have countless episodes where characters are just repeating stuff that we've seen in previous episodes. Or we'll have countless episodes where characters are having internal monologue, which by and large, don't really add any new information than we already knew. When you take in consideration how not only the original material from the manga, but also the original translations from the Japanese version of the anime, yeah, by the time you get to the English dub, you're gonna run into some issues. The final thing I'll mention in terms of the objective qualities of the original Dragon Ball Z series, and this is when we get down to the visuals. Let's be honest about it. Now, I understand that every anime is sort of limited to the technology that's available at its time. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of, say, CGI and things of that nature, you know, I'm a diehard 2D animation fan. I love traditional animation, and I will admit, there are times in which Dragon Ball Z is some of the best traditionally animated anime that you will ever see. But once again, remember what I brought up earlier in this video about how Toei Animation was actually utilizing 3 different animation studios in order to complete production of this series? Well, guess what? That presented a problem because there are multiple episodes, the best of which I think you can find in the Frieza saga and in the Cell saga. There are multiple episodes where the animation quality isn't congruent. You can tell where Toei's main studio, the episodes that they produced, and then you could tell the ones where some of the smaller studios who were producing some of that filler content I mentioned earlier, where their work came into play. And you can see the difference. You can tell. It's almost from episode by episode, the animation quality will dip and then go back up, dip and go back up. And like I said, when you're looking at this series as a whole, especially remember how we consume media in 2019, let you be marathoning the Frieza fight, or let you marathon any of those Android fights. When you start seeing that dip in quality in animation, it's glaring and it's obvious and you can tell. Once again, let's bring Dragon Ball Kai back into play. Dragon Ball Kai, on the other hand, notice how it is much more congruent. The quality of animation is essentially on par throughout most of that series. Let's be honest about this. Whenever you want to talk about DBZ Kai, you are talking about hindsight being 2020. Why? Because this is a production that was made years after the original series. They had the luxury and they had the benefit to kind of trim this, cut this out, clean this up to make it a much better looking production. But that does not change the validity of my original argument, because we still have to take that original series for what it is and how it was delivered to us. And with that being said, animation quality does not stay concurrent across the board. Now we're going to jump into the subjective portion of this video. And when I say subjective, I mean that most of my criticism towards the original DBZ series from this point in time will be predicated more on just personal opinion and personal taste. Let's be honest, I would not be making this video if I had not acquired a change of taste. My change of taste as it pertains to the Dragon Ball series mostly has to do a lot with the story. It has to do a lot with the narrative, the meta-narrative, and by and large, my interpretation of what that means, looking at it now as an almost 30-year-old man, as opposed to the 9-year-old boy I was when I was first introduced to the series. I mean, let's be honest about this. Dragon Ball Z, from a narrative standpoint, isn't too much different than, say, Power Rangers. The story really doesn't matter that much as it pertains to just getting us to a fight. Anything that looks like a story, those are just episodes that are leading us up to the inevitable fight that really, that's the only reason we're tuning in for. Because let's be real about this, guys, and come on, let's not lie about this. What made DBZ so popular in the States as well as worldwide was because it was the quintessential action anime series. It was the quintessential anime series for boys, and action is typically what boys wanted in such a series. It stands to reason that that would sort of be the warmth and womb of the DBZ series. We're just here for the fights. That's what we're tuning in for. It's no different than a boxing match, MMA, or WWF. Now WWE, for example. Because let's be real about this. Even us wrestling fans, which I was a huge one back at that time, the stories only really mattered so much as they resulted in a great main event match at the pay-per-view at the end of the month, right? DBZ in many respects is the same way. Now, like I said, Well, why is that causing a problem for me now if I know that's what that series was always about in the first place? Well, because my taste has changed. My taste has matured as I've gotten older. That's not to say that I still can't appreciate a good knockout, drag-out anime fight. I can. But I would go as far as to say that for me, the stakes need to be higher. And there needs to be a purpose behind the stakes. So you can't just tell me that, oh, well, if Goku and the rest of the characters don't defeat this villain, he'll destroy the Earth. Okay, yeah, it's the end of the world. Those are high enough stakes. But what's the reasoning behind it? And do the reasonings make sense to me? Does the villain's motive make sense to me? Is there enough emotional investment for me to actually care about what happens to those characters? And when you have a plot device such as 7 magical balls that can grant any wish, that essentially fulfill the same function as the eternal elusive Super Nintendo reset button, yeah, there aren't really any stakes. Nothing sticks. No one stays dead. Nothing stays destroyed. Why? Because after the fight, we can just gather up the Dragon Balls and wish everything back to the way it was before that event even took place in the first place. So yeah, when you think about it, there are no stakes. There are no consequences. And nothing really matters. Just like in professional wrestling. After the big fight, we just press the reset button and now we're on to a new narrative. Now, for a lot of fans, that might be cool, but for me personally, that doesn't really matter. Now, are there other anime that implemented the same thing? Yes, indeed. I also got a lot of flack in my live stream for revealing that Yu Yu Hakusho was now my favorite all-time anime series. And a lot of people were angry about that. Why? Because they say Yu Yu Hakusho suffered from a lot of the same issues as the original Dragon Ball Z anime. That much is true, and I can see that fact. But Yu Yu Hakusho is a lot shorter. It's a lot more streamlined. There's not as much filler. I can't even think of any filler for that matter. And here's the thing. Even though a lot of those story arcs resulted in a big fight, and a lot of the fights did result in sort of a cataclysmic stakes, there was a lot more personal investment in those stories, in those stakes. What those conflicts meant to the characters within those stories differed throughout the course of the series. Things mattered a little more or a little less depending on who the character was and what their outlook and perception of that event was at that given point in time. DBZ doesn't really offer that. It doesn't really offer that type of depth, that type of introspection with a lot of its characters. I don't really get that. Well, let me rephrase that. The only 2 characters, by and large, that I think we get any sort of real depth or emotional investment in, funny enough, Vegeta and Trunks. And even Trunks is kind of meh. Vegeta's the main one because he's the main character that we see with a objective character arc throughout the entire series. Goku doesn't really have that much of a character arc if you really think about it. And Gohan, yeah, his is the coming of age story, but let's be honest about this. After Cell Saga, we just dropped him like a bad habit to where his arc doesn't really matter anymore. And then the rest of the characters, never mind what happens with Piccolo, what happens with Yamcha, Tien, Chaozu, Krillin, Bulma, Chi-Chi, any of the rest of them. Yeah, no, most of their character progression was really in the original Dragon Ball series, not the DBZ series. And yeah, we do some stuff with Piccolo, for sure, but even Piccolo's storyline after Cell Saga, that buck pretty much stops there. So yeah, for me personally, the stakes in some of these story arcs in DBZ, they just don't hold up. They don't have much weight to them. They don't really matter at all. And this is the one part of this video where I actually will bring up Dragon Ball Super, because the main reason I was never able to get into that series was because it was more of the same and a lot more of the stuff that I didn't like about the original series. Case in point with the whole Tournament of Power bit. The fact that that whole thing pretty much boiled down to, oh, well, some of these alternate universes have weaker inhabitants, and because for some odd reason, the almighty, all-powerful deity of the Dragon Ball universe decided that, you know what, weakness is not a quality that I treasure, so you guys get to get wiped out. And whichever one is the strongest among you, that'll be the one I allow to stay. But the rest of you guys, boom, gone, blinked out of existence. There are some serious issues with what that entails. And as I mentioned before, when we talk about the meta-narrative, what is the underlining message that the Dragon Ball Z series is telling its viewers? When your god only really values the strong and the rest of you weaker beings are disposable, that's a terrible meta-narrative to tell to your viewership, especially children. So yeah, when you take those things into consideration, DBZ really doesn't hold up. It really doesn't hold up. Now, for the sake of not making this video any much longer and to not branch too far outside of the original series, which was the main focus of this video, I think I'll go ahead and leave it there. But by all means, like I said, this made for a thrilling debate when I brought it up in the live stream, and I have absolutely no doubt in my mind it'll make for a thrilling debate in the comments below. So please feel free, share your thoughts on the Dragon Ball Z series on this video, and let's get the debate going. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, please feel free to thumb it up. And until next time, this has been Larry Williams of OAW Entertainment, and I'll catch you on the next video. Peace.